There's only one thing in life that's sure, and that's death and taxes. And sometimes I'm not so sure about death. Hello, today I want to talk to you about noble courts and their budgets, how they get money in, and what they spend money on. My name is Marie Mullaney, and this is another episode of Just-in-Time Worlds and Fantasy World Building. So first we should discuss, where does money come from for a noble court in the medieval or faux medieval age? Obviously, there is some income from taxes. However, you need to be aware here that taxation was not as common as you might think. We have regular taxation based on your income, a percentage-based income. But what tended to happen pre the current modern era is taxes would be levied on a once-off basis. It wasn't something that was necessarily gathered every year. And it would very rarely be levied across the land. What would generally happen is a noble would tax their direct tenants and would then pay the king his dues. And generally, it was a land-based tax, so a tax based on more of a rent income. So the king owned the land, he rented it to the nobles rented it to peasant farmers, the peasant farmers paid the noble. But when the king needed to raise special taxes, this was often done as a poll tax, a per head tax. So every man had to pay a penny. Sometimes it was levied as a kind of a wealth tax. There's a king of Denmark called Plougpenning, because he levied a penny for every plough that a man owned. So an almost wealth-based tax. Such taxes, such poll taxes, could sometimes lead to unintended consequences. In fact, the Peasants' Rebellion, led by Wat Tyler, that I previously referenced in my video on rebellion, was caused by a poll tax, a per head tax. Such taxation also eventually in England became the cause for the Magna Carta to be formed and for the creation of a form of parliament where people could be represented. So the king could no longer levy taxes, only parliament could levy taxes. It's the whole taxation and representation being closely linked. So if you're going to tax me, I better have some say in the matter. So if it wasn't primarily taxation, how did the nobles of old make money? Well, I already spoke about rent. So renting land to peasants was obviously one way in which they made money. Another was being farmers themselves. In Kushiel's Chosen, the second book of the Kushiel series by Jacqueline Carey, the heroine Phaedra has inherited a noble title, and with it has come lands. And on these lands, she now has sheep, which are the primary farming produce. So when the sheep are sheared and the wool sales come in, then she gets the majority of her money that she has for the year from her actual farming practices. And she also has tenant farmers who have their own little plots of land for which they pay rent. This kind of income from land can lead to some very interesting conflict. In the world of the Millennium, which is a world created by David Eddings, nobles who don't have an heir would often leave their lands to the church. This resulted in those lands being permanently removed from the crown's tax rolls. This led to a conflict between the crown and the church because the church got richer every time a noble did this, and the crown, of course, got less and less control over their own lands. So you can use that kind of income from land in very interesting ways to breed conflict into your setting. If we look at Game of Thrones, you can also see how redistribution of land after something like a rebellion plays a large role in securing the loyalty of those who supported you. One of the primary forms of conflict in Game of Thrones is that between Robert and Stannis Baratheon and their younger brother Renly. This conflict is exacerbated because Robert, when he had conquered everything and everybody had bowed the knee and he was now the king of the Seven Kingdoms, he appointed Stannis to be the steward of Dragonstone, which is a poor region. There's not a lot of farming going on that island. There's not a lot of money coming in on that island. And Stannis was looking forward to inheriting Storm's End, which is a very rich land. It's a very rich castle. But instead, Robert gave Storm's End to Renly Baratheon. And this move by Robert led to conflict between the three brothers, because now Stannis is feeling hard done by. He's feeling like his brother has made him poor, and Renly is feeling like his brother has endorsed him as the next king because he did not give their ancestral home to Stannis, as was Stannis's right by birth. It was a very interesting conflict coming at the heart of it from the wealth of land that a noble can have. There is one more way in which nobles can gain money, and that is by the income of war or the income of conflict. First, there is just straight up looting. Going to another country, beating up the population and taking their stuff has always been a popular means of swelling your coffers. In a world where there is also slavery, you can also take slaves as battle loot. So the defeated soldiers could become slave, the population of the cities that you conquer could become slaves. This was actually pretty common during the Bronze Age of our world. Bronze and classical, because Romans famously built their wealth extensively through this kind of battle slavery. But there's also some other means of war that result to an increase in monetary wealth from a country, and one of them is war reparations. War reparations is when the losing country is forced by the winning country to carry the cost of war by paying them tribute, paying them actual monetary tribute. This happened after the Second World War, it happened after the First World War, it happened going into the past all the way down to the Middle Ages. Forcing the losing country to pay tribute is a time-honored tradition. And the last way in which war can help the coffers of a country or an individual is through the taking of hostages. Famously, Richard the Lionheart was taken hostage coming home from the Crusades, and England had to spring for an enormous sum of money to set him free. In fantasy, Katherine Kerr uses this kind of hostage-taking to excellent effect. Her nobles are occasionally captured and then set free in return for monetary wealth. Common soldiers will dream of taking a lord hostage because this will set them up for a life of luxury. For a lord who is kind of poorish, it's also an excellent way of not just winning the war, but potentially making their fortune. This kind of hostage-taking allows you to save the life of key characters while still forcing them to pay the consequences of war. Paying a ransom could lead to somebody being beggared, and that kind of financial ruin can have dire consequences for a character. It also leads to a loss of face and a loss of honor. You were taken captive in battle. So you lost the battle, but you didn't die, which allows the story to continue, but still levies a penalty for losing. So I highly recommend this as a means for both getting money into a court and as a means for resolving conflict between warring states, rather than just killing everyone. The last way in which nobles could garner money into their treasury was through loan. Now, loans are a little tricky. I spoke in my banking video about how the Templars were gyppoed by Philip of France when he essentially declared them a heretic organization and therefore just didn't pay his debts. And that was always a risk with loaning to nobles. The Jews encountered this as well. If they loaned to nobles, sometimes the nobles would just be like, nope, I'm not going to pay Jews back, and then just expel all Jews from the city and be like, yep, no more debt. So oftentimes, banks or institutions like banks would insist on some kind of collateral. Now, if you implement this in your world, that kind of collateral can be a fascinating form of tension. Because what happens if your characters can't pay the loan back? Do they lose the collateral? What if they lose their family's home because they can't pay a loan back? What if they have to enter a form of bondage slavery if they can't pay the loan back? One of the most fun use of collateral that I've seen in fantasy comes from Jacqueline Carey, again in Kushiel's Chosen. So Phaedra needs some money, and she goes to a financial institution and says, okay, I need this amount of money. And they're like, well, no. Either you have to put up some collateral or we're just not lending it to you. So maybe you could put up a part of your land holdings. And she's like, no, I'm not going to gamble with my land holdings. But Phaedra is a prostitute. So she puts up as collateral a night with her because her asking price is 1,000 ducats a night. The loan shark is like, I'm sorry, how do you want me to evaluate this? And then she plays a striptease for him in his office, and he's like, yep, no, loan approved. It was fantastic in the context of what it was used in. So you can use that kind of collateral to both build tension and to world build and to show what the character's skill sets are. Okay, so those are the ways you get money in: war, land, taxes, loans. But where does the money go? First, let's talk about the expense of a noble court. Bearing in mind that a noble court has got a couple of big expenditures. Firstly, you have to pay your servants' salaries. You have to give your servants a place to stay. Generally, you have to provide your servants with some kind of uniform clothes. All of those things cost money. You can also gather some of that in taxes. Katherine Kerr does this in her world, where the peasants will often pay their taxes in kind with wheels of cheese or eggs or bread. So on a weekly basis, they will bring some food to the castle, which supports the Lord's court by means of this bounty of food and clothing. But some things do straight up cost money, and you have to gather that money in to support the court. If you are running a noble court where other nobles come, like a royal court where you have nobles who are there to attend court, you have additional expenditures. Because these nobles, potentially, you need to feed them. They need to drink. You need to host feasts and tournaments. Think again of Game of Thrones, where Robert Baratheon's love for tournaments has drained the royal treasury to such an extent that they have to go into massive debt with the Iron Bank just to keep functioning normally. So in Songwheel Chronicles, in my world, the imperial court doesn't feed nobles unless it is an actual official feast. So if you're a noble attending the imperial court, you have to bring your own food and your own drink to court, and you have a person appointed who looks after your food and drink, and then your cupbearer or your gentleman in waiting or your lady in waiting goes and fetches food for you and your guests. This cuts down on the emperor's expense, but it also gives the nobles the opportunity to flex their wealth, to show off their delicacies from their part of the empire. If you think my world sounds interesting, the first 4 chapters of The Ducal Heir is available on my website, and you can give them a read and let me know what you think. One of the best uses of the expense of that kind of court that I've seen comes from Judith Tarr. Now, she writes historical fiction, and one of her historical characters is Richard the Lionheart. There are some of his nobles that he believes were part of the rebellion, but he cannot directly tie them to it. So what he does in order to control them is he takes his whole royal court and goes and visits them. What this does is it forces that noble to pay the cost of the royal court for like a week. That kind of expense of hosting the royal court could beggar a lesser noble. And indeed, that is what Richard used it for. He drained the coffers of the nobles that he was visiting by taking his court from rebellious noble to rebellious noble, and essentially making it so that they could not afford to put an army in the field. So just the cost of a court is already quite high. But then you have additional cost implications from flexing. As I've mentioned before, for nobility, it's always important to flex your position. It's important to show why you hold this position, why you're entitled to all this wealth. As such, they need to flex. Historically, you can see this in things like the Field of the Cloth of Gold. This is where Henry VIII and Francis I met, and they discussed a potential treaty. These two erected pavilions to stay in. Henry's pavilion was, I kid you not, a full hectare. It's a tented cloth pavilion that covers a full hectare. It had a great hall, it had a chapel inside it. Outside the pavilion, he erected a fountain that sprayed claret, spiced wine and water in 3 different ranulets. I mean, can you actually imagine? That was the level of flex that nobles maintained. And that kind of thing costs real money. So you need to spend money on flexing as well. And then lastly, we spoke about the income you get from war, but there is also a cost associated with war. You need to feed your soldiers if you're planning on having them be capable of winning at the end of the battle. Sometimes you need to provide weaponry for your soldiers, arrows and so on for archers. All of that costs money. If you lose, you have to pay reparations to the winner, and your city gets looted, so you might very well lose a great deal of wealth in the looting. Or your population gets taken as slaves, so you might lose the population to maintain the farms to have agriculture running. And then, of course, you could be taken hostage, and then you need to pay for that hostage taking. So war is a gamble. If you lose, the cost of war is very high in a medieval or faux medieval setting. Of course, I'd argue the cost of war is always high, but that's a different question around morality and the cost of life, and is very dependent on your setting. So that is my take on royal budgets and noble budgets and how they get money in and where they spend their money. If you enjoyed this video, do give it a thumbs up. It really does help with the algorithm. And if you'd like me to explore any of these topics in deeper context, let me know in the comments below. And I will see you soon for another video.